Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. I'm really glad you're able to come back, John. We've tried this a couple of times already, and I think we got it this time.
Well, this is his third time on the podcast, but only the second time our listeners are getting to listen to him.
That's how it happens, man.
Well, I think a lot of folks think we know what we're doing, and, we've been through 112 or 13 of these or whatever, and this thing's like a well-oiled machine, but that is far from the truth. In fact, if we didn't have Charlotte, we wouldn't have actually recorded anything yet, I don't think. But it's always fun, John. I know we hadn't seen each other in a while. Glad to see you. I also know that a lot of folks are ramping up for burning season, and there's a lot of interest from people that want to get going on their property, and you are probably dealing with a lot of that in your job day to day. And I know that you're extremely knowledgeable about it. So that's what we wanted to talk to you about today.
Appreciate that, Marcus. We're already in the kind of heat of it. Usually, of course, we try to push for a 365-day burn season, but we know that's not exactly true. So folks are definitely in the time frame where they're looking at getting their fires going. Generally, most of our burning, whether we want it or not, is going to happen between deer season, turkey season. And that's just part of it. That's fine, especially for maintenance burdens and whatnot. But hopefully people would put some thought in ahead of time to see if they can maybe get a hold of some different planning.
I know you're working with a bunch of landowners, and I'm glad you're doing it too. So I appreciate all the work you're putting in trying to get folks started on burning. But I think that is a challenge. There's obviously a learning curve and a barrier to entry. And I just wanted you to talk about, in your experience, how you manage those. How do you get landowners that have not been burning to interested in it and pass those barriers, so that they start burning?
Sure. Well, sure, man. That's a big question we talk a lot about. I think one thing we have to do is look at burning just like any other skill we talk about. So if you think about becoming an electrician or any of the trades, you kind of have a progression to mastery, right? So you start out and you're an apprentice, and then over a period of time you get good and you can become a journeyman, and then eventually you're the master. You're the master craftsman, right? You've mastered all the aspects of the trade. And then you go forth and you can teach other people about it. So I think if we think about prescribed burning like that, you start to think, well, I'm still in my apprentice phase, or maybe I haven't initiated my apprenticeship. How can I apprentice myself in fire? Now, the nice thing about some of the trades, my son is doing welding. He welds a lot. If you mess a weld up, you can kind of throw it over in the corner. But you don't have as a forgiving of a learning curve with something like prescribed fire. So I think really there are a couple of steps in the process, and I would say initially landowners really need to think about, what are my motivations? Like, why am I burning? Why do I think burning is a good thing? And so if you think burning is a good thing because you like bobwhites and you want bobwhites on your property, that's a little bit different kind of apprenticeship or a different kind of learning curve, a different type of activity than if we start talking about somebody who wants to burn because they want to grow cleaner pine stands for pine production, right? There's two different types of regimes of using fire. And so I think the first step is really outlining your goals. Why do I want to burn? And then once you've outlined your goals, your objectives, whatever, need to start kind of putting together a little bit of a plan. Now, putting together a plan sounds ominous and like it's a lot of work, man. I mean, you can start small, just activity maps, things like that. Get out your crayons and figure out, where do we want to do what. Channel your inner Bob Ross, and and make a happy little fire plot here, there, and yon. But the big thing is to remember, why am I in this? What do I want to accomplish? And then how can I progress myself towards mastery? And for some folks, that's not going to be the game, right? They're going to say, well, I'm never going to be my own contractor. I'm never going to do the burning myself. And that's fine. They're going to have to outsource that and pay folks. And there's more to it than just finding somebody doing that. You got to make sure you find a good vendor and all those things. But we can talk about more of that.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And something you said that resonated with me is, why are you burning? Trying to establish that at the outset. And you gave a species specific example, but I think sometimes we even need to go further than that and think about, like, if we're burning for deer, are we burning for winter cover? Are we burning for summer forage? And there's lots of different ways that we might burn depending on what aspect of deer habitat we're trying to take on. But one thing I did also want to ask you is, do you try to help landowners when they establish that species-specific objective? At that same time, do you also try to start talking to them about the plant community that they're going to be after with fire, so that they can recognize when they've achieved that or when they need to do something about it, i.e. burn again or something along those lines?
Yeah. It depends is the answer. So, we say it depends all the time. I pick at that. I think it depends on the individual landowner. When we try to customize recommendations, you're also kind of maybe a little bit customizing talking points. And so if we have folks that are, sometimes I guess I use sports analogies all the time, but like Nick Saban talks about, having a game plan is really good. But then, by the way, it hurts me to use a University of Alabama example. I just want y'all to know that pains me deeply. But Nick Saban talks about having a game plan. And then he says, you got to concentrate on your process. What's your next step?
Yeah.
Get the next play, breaking it down. You'll hear that from football coaches all the time. And so I think it kind of depends on where that landowner is in their process as to whether we start talking about something perhaps as advanced as plant communities.
Okay.
Sometimes we just want to get that first win. We want
Yeah.
to get that first step in and concentrate on accomplishing a thing, And then I think after that, you start looking like, how can I sustain this thing that I accomplished? And then we start to get into the specific, all right, so now we need to adapt our management. We need to start thinking about, I did it this way, and based on literature, based on experience, if I adapt my approach, then I could get a different result,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So again, it just depends on where people are in their process.
So that's usually on down the road.
It may not be. You may have somebody. I did a funny story, man. I did a site visit, or I have a landowner that's a PhD botanist, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And his thing is just getting over the hump. I need the how, not the why. And he's teaching me stuff about the plant community. So I mean, it's different, And we've had landowners now. You got those apps, man. You got the little plant apps. People grab onto those, and man, they take off with it. And they can fly, and some people look at it, and it's like a cow looking at a new gate. You start talking about plants, and they don't make no sense. So I mean, everybody's a little bit different. Those apps kill me, man. I'm a plant guy, so I feel like John Henry in the steam engine. Like every time somebody whips out their phone, I'm like, no, I want to beat the app. But no, I mean, it just all depends on that landowner and their process. And I would encourage people to focus on the parts that make sense to you. Let's keep the big picture in mind, certainly. But, I've had landowners before, man. I had a guy that was a really good fabricator. He was an engineer at his day job. And the parts that made sense to him were the equipment and all that kind of stuff. And then we could even start there and then move forward. I've had people before that, physicians, sometimes doctors are hard to work with because they want to start with the details, man. They want to get nitpick early in the process. It just depends on where people are and kind of speaking to where they are and adapting that approach. And everybody's just kind of got to do a little self-assessment and figure out, where am I and where do I need to concentrate?
Yeah, meet them where they are is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So usually the biggest thing I would say, if somebody's never burned before, just talking in generic terms, they've never really burned before and they're like, man, I want to get started. The first thing we'll do again is try to start small. And they say, look, this is my objective. This is why I'm burning. So we'll pick out a block and kind of think about it in the context of that plan. Pick out a block and say, all right, let's try to get this one executed first. And so after you've decided your reasoning, your why, and then your kind of where I want to start, the biggest thing when we get going, and this is true for all prescribed fire, everybody's going to say this first thing we get to looking at is containment. How am I going to keep the fire? How am I going to make it prescribed as opposed to wild?
Mm-hmm.
We don't want that the second kind, right? We want it to be prescribed. Prescribed fire is the precise use of a tool, right? So when we start talking about containment, that just means, I'll use jargon sometimes, but we talk about containment, we're just keeping the fire where we want it and not where we don't. And so, how are we going to accomplish that? And again, you got to look at folks, what equipment do we have available? So we'll kind of do a resource inventory. I guess maybe that's the first step. Maybe we do a resource inventory and we start looking at what do we have available, what type of equipment, what type of manpower. Are you guys in a hunting camp or something where we can leverage more manpower? Are we in a situation where we need to outsource manpower? We're going to have to pay for that. Do you have communications set up? Do we have tools for suppression? And so once we've done that inventory and we've decided where we want the fire, we've decided how we want containment, then we start looking at execution. So, there's just all kinds of steps in the process.
John, that's good stuff. It kind of brought to mind a few things for me, but one, I just wanted you to talk explicitly about, for folks that haven't embarked on this at all yet, what would you say, I guess, is the minimum requirement in terms of the equipment, for suppression and communication, all those sorts of things that you're talking about? What do they need at a minimum to start the process from your perspective?
Sure. That's a good question. I've just thought of something. I'm going to come back to that. I jumped ahead a little bit. Probably the first step, I should say, is you need to check on the laws and the legal ramifications of burning in your state. I should have probably started with keeping people out of jail. But if you, depending on what state you're in, you have different organizations that are the statutory authority for prescribed fire. In Mississippi, it's the Forestry Commission. I believe that's true in most southern states, at least. So, you need to kind of research that and make sure. Mississippi is a right to burn state. So if you're a landowner, you can burn your own property pretty much without anything that's encumbering you. However, if you want limited liability under the law, you need to look into that. And so first thing we need to do is make sure we're legal. The second thing we start to do is look at liability. And, we kind of jumped ahead to execution, but that's because, again, we got time constraints and all. We could spend a whole episode just talking about liability. But what we're about to talk about with the execution, you're limiting your liability by educating yourself, apprenticing yourself in fire, and learning how to execute it properly. So again, I skipped a step on the legal side of things. Definitely do that first. So circling back, you asked about minimum requirements, and that really is what kind of jarred my legal mind. All that again depends. What we say from a legal term is we want to do things that are reasonable and prudent. Mm-hmm. So when you say what are the minimum requirements, the minimum requirement's a match, but the minimum requirement to be reasonable and prudent, that's a different question. And so a reasonable and prudent person in certain scenarios, those requirements can change. So if we're burning in the deep south and we have volatile fuels, we're going to have different requirements as opposed to if we're burning maybe in the Midwest and we're just burning grass, And so I would say in the mid-south and deep south, in general, a minimum requirement to execute a fire is going to be something we can make bare dirt with. So a tractor with a disc or perhaps a bulldozer, depending on your situation, right? And we try to avoid, intensive soil disturbance. We really do, for a lot of reasons. But something to make bare dirt is a pretty big deal. Some type of equipment, heavy equipment usually. course, you can do that with rakes, with hand tools. You're just going to have more manpower, and it's going to take more time.
Mm-hmm.
But so once we've had something to make bare dirt with, the next thing you mentioned, minimum requirements. I mean, nowadays cell phones are reliable enough. You might could say cell phone for communication. That would be good. But I like to have radios. We tend to like at least 5 watt. Something that you can go a mile or two. We don't have to have line of sight to be able to get communication.
And even if you have good cell reception, they're just convenient to be able to pick up and just key the mic and talk instead of taking off a glove and dialing a number and all that.
Exactly. Well, the other thing is we don't want to tie up cell phones. So
Right.
if something goes bad, we need to use the cell phone then.
Right.
And so I don't like to tie them up. I personally think the radio is the most important piece of equipment. But after you've got something to make bare dirt, some kind of containment or something to catch a fire, if you had to jump, some type of equipment and some type of communication, we start looking at hand tools. And people go all directions with hand tools. Anymore, I've come to like a blower, a good leaf blower. John Stivers says you want something that can knock the hair off a cat. But if you really research this, I enjoy being around people. I'm not this person, but people that geek out on that stuff, like how much air displacement you have in certain leaf blowers and these different models and all that. You need to find you one of those people, you know what I mean, and make buddies with them. It's kind of like having my people ask me if I have a boat. I'm like, no, I'm trying to make a friend that has a boat, Whatever skill you need, that's where you got to find your friend group, right? And I guess online now you can find all that stuff too. But man, some type of good blower, some type of hand tool, a rake. We use council rakes, fire rakes a lot, and then people use flappers. There's just all kinds of, you get online, you can really geek out on tools, fire tools. And probably the most important hand tool outside of some of those suppression tools is going to be your ignition source. And for the most part, we're going to use a drip torch for ignition. Y'all are familiar with it. Coming up, I remember hearing them called fire pots. People have different names for them, but basically a drip torch is just going to be a vessel with a wick that holds fuel, and we use different types of fuel. There's all kinds of stuff we could talk about there, but I would say that's kind of your minimum, right? We need heavy equipment. We need some type. Well, okay, I wouldn't say heavy equipment. We need something to make bare dirt. We need something to suppress the fire, either by flapping it, so snuffing it out, or by controlling the oxygen. So we need bare dirt, we need something to control oxygen source, and we need an ignition source. Those are going to be your minimums. And then from there, we start talking about that reasonable and prudent. So how much bare dirt? How much suppression equipment? How many people, right? And all that depends. If I'm burning 500 acres and it's not, volatile fuel 500 acres, we might need a big crew. If you're doing, 40 acres of grass, you might not need a big crew.
Mm-hmm.
It just all depends after that as to what is the minimum standard.
And I think that's where that apprenticeship experience comes in, is you learn what's reasonable and prudent by being out on some fires and seeing how experienced practitioners handle it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The next big ticket thing too, we just talked about minimums. We talked about equipment. And the part of apprenticing yourself is, again, knowing when to react and when not to react. And so that takes some learning, some skill. You're going to have to educate yourself. You can learn a lot of this online, but I would encourage everybody to look into the coursework that's offered in their state. So in Mississippi, we have a prescribed burning school. I know certified prescribed burn manager is a training that we can do. Several other states have that type of training. Alabama has a really good one. Georgia has a very good one. Not familiar with Florida, but I'm sure it's good. And then you have extension after that, where once there are levels of education you can pursue. And so I would encourage everybody to educate themselves. And then again, part of that apprenticeship is having somebody to mentor you. So if you can find a local mentor, that's a really good help. And that may be somebody that's a government employee. It may be a neighbor. You never know. It could be a volunteer fire community. Sometimes those guys are sources of knowledge. Sometimes they're we put them out, we don't start them type folks, and then sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're actually really helpful, and so we have some of those rural fire departments where you can learn a lot quick.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, John, that I've never really mentioned or shared with people before. But having a prescribed burning mentor has been really critical to my development as a burner, and specifically just being able to pick up that phone and say, hey, I've got this tract. Here's the description of it. I'm thinking about burning it next week. And this is, kind of the weather conditions of the past few days. And this is what they're calling for on the day of the burn. you think I'm
Absolutely.
likely to have, the intensity that I'm after. And I mean, Marcus, I still every now and then I'll pick your brain about a burn that I'm about to
Mhm.
do too and say, yeah, I'm not really feeling good about this one. This is what the wind and the humidity are doing. How do you think it's going to go?
Yeah, it's
And
great to
and
have people to bounce that stuff off of,
yeah,
even
yeah.
even as an experienced burner.
And I
Yeah.
think where you can get that is like John says, through these learn and burn events and prescribed burners associations and things like that. That's where you're going to
Mhm.
meet your mentors that you can pick up the phone or shoot that text over to and say, "Hey, just double checking. Am I crazy or am I sane? Like does
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
think this is going to work out all right?"
Well, I want to unpack that a little bit further, but I don't think we're quite to the part of the conversation yet for the question I was going to ask John. I want to talk about what kinds of resources are like that are available to folks, and you kind of talk about that. But before we get there, you mentioned the right to burn laws and
Yeah.
the limited liability, that sort of thing. I think that's one of the major barriers for people, and you
Yes.
can
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think you agree. What can I don't want you to go into detail about what the right to burn laws are necessarily, but rather go into what do people need to do so that they are covered under that. Like if you're a private landowner and you're going
Sure.
to start prescribed burning, what are the steps that they're taking to make sure that they're protected under those laws?
Sure. And every state, of course, is different, but for the most part, it's going to include having some type of a plan. And in our state, we're supposed to get this. In Mississippi, you're supposed to get the burn plan notarized. And again, it doesn't actually say how long before the burn, but a reasonable and prudent person would probably do that at least one day before the burn. And so, you have to have a plan, usually in most states. You're also going to have some type of permit. And in Mississippi, you call the Forestry Commission, you get a smoke permit. Most states in the South, they're going to be, again, state forestry is going to require some type of permitting. So you have a plan, you have a permit, and then the next level of that in Mississippi, we say it has to be in the public interest. So that just means it can be arson. You can't call and get a permit and have a plan and go light your neighbors on fire. You know what I mean? You're not going to get limited liability for that, right? So you have to have that plan and that permit. And it has to be in the public interest. And then generally, there's going to be some level of certification for the burn boss. So those four things: public interest, which just means it can be arson, some type of permit, some type of plan, and then some level of certification or qualification for the person leading the burn. So again, in Mississippi, you're certified prescribed burn manager. I know Florida, Georgia have that. Alabama has that program as well. Louisiana has certified burn managers. So those four things in general, and I know three of those at least are going to be pretty consistent across most of the states. Um, and what that does when we say limited liability, that doesn't mean you're not going to get sued. That just means your liability should be limited under the law. So in Mississippi, we don't have case law to actually support that. It's crazy. In Alabama, I know this is true too. They don't have case law. So as long as we've had Mississippi's laws from 1992, as long as we've had these laws, they haven't even been challenged. Generally, that's because if there's an incident, people settle out of court. But it's also because if you follow all those things, you probably aren't going to, you're already going to limit
Mm-hmm.
your possibility that you're going to have an uh-oh, right? You've already got a plan. You've thought ahead. You've already got an expert burner or somebody that knows what they're doing, right? They've gotten certification. That doesn't just mean you filled a piece of paper out. You actually went to some type of training and got certified, so you halfway know what you're doing. And then, we've called and made sure and got a permit. They're going to issue a permit on a day when the fire might be volatile, but they're generally not going to issue permits on days when we're going to have smoke liability issues. So just those three things right there, they didn't pull those out of thin air. Those are, those are good things to have. And so the other thing that people are going to ask about when we start talking about liability is insurance. And I'll just bring that up. But Tall Timbers is doing a lot of good stuff right now with insurance. So if you Google and go on Tall Timbers website, they're making a lot of moves there. John McGuire, who's coordinating a lot of their private lands prescribed burn efforts, is a really good source of knowledge there. But he and others are working. That's going to be a state to state issue, right? On just like pretty much all insurance is going to be state to state. but there are a very few groups that offer prescribed burn policies for burners, for burn managers. But if you're an individual private landowner, you need to talk to your farm policy insurance and see if you need to add a rider. If you're going to be doing burning, you need to make sure what your farm policy covers and doesn't cover. So that's kind of the short on the insurance and that not very short, but the short on the insurance and the legal. That again, like you said, I don't. That's not the stuff that I spend a lot of time on or enjoy. But you're exactly right. That's usually like the second question that most landowners ask is about my what type of liability am I?
Mm-hmm.
So, John, I work with a lot of landowners as well around the South, and I get the question, I guess, fairly commonly, and I know that you'll be very knowledgeable about Mississippi, but maybe not outside of that. What are some of the resources available? I know you mentioned the prescribed fire training. We mentioned a little bit about learning burns. What are some other examples of ways that people can get some mentorship and training, but also maybe even resources, even financial resources? Are there things like that available that might even help cost share prescribed burning?
Sure. Well, a couple of things there. In terms of resources, I don't want to skip over. We talked about learning and education. I don't want to skip over weather resources. I think we've all kind of dropped a few, like, hey, what's the humidity and all that.
Mm-hmm.
I think people like, sometimes you get too deep into a thing and you don't bring along the details sometimes. One of the big things that we spend fire people tend to really geek out on weather. So I would encourage you to become a student of weather. And one of your big resources, obviously, NOAA. Their website is not super user-friendly, but there's a wealth of knowledge on that website. You can use individual weather apps. And I would encourage you, we all start looking at the weather on the day of the burn, the day before the burn. I would encourage you to make it a habit to look at the weather all the time, and not just whether or not it's going to rain or how hot it's going to be, but start looking at relative humidity all the time, and start looking at what it does throughout the day and kind of learn your geography. I know that my low relative humidity is going to be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I know, my winds are prevailing out of this and that direction. It's rare for me to get a south wind, but I get a south wind when this happens. These are the kind of things that I would start now, even before you're going to burn. Start apprenticing yourself in those resources there, the weather resources. So and that's
valuable.
fun anyway. Oh man, it's fun anyway. Like when you really geek out on weather, like I remember, learning all this stuff, and then new things you learn along the way, even though you think you understand it. Like really starting to understand dew point and things like that. Or really when other things start to click, you're like, oh, wow. So, I can have a 30% humidity and this wind and it burns one way, but I have a 30% humidity and different, and it burns totally differently. I don't understand. And then the next thing you start looking at is fuel, like how the fuels react and all. It's just one of those, fire is one of those types of things that I don't think you'll ever learn all of it, but the more you learn, the more appreciation you have for it. So I would, just start finding those resources for individuals in terms of websites, but in terms of organizations and people, obviously, the extension services are going to be really good. Your forestry or whichever, depending on your state, your state forestry commission or agriculture department could be a potentially valuable resource. Your state fish and game agency. So obviously in Mississippi, that's who I work for. In every state, it's a little bit different, but most of these organizations are going to have county level staff. In the case of fish and game, maybe it's a regional staff. The other one we don't want to leave out are these NGOs, man. Quail Forever is a huge employer now, and I know their staff gets training on prescribed fire. QDMA has regional staff in some state, or I'm sorry, they're NDA now. NDA has regional staff in some areas that are going to be knowledgeable about fire. And then another big one, so these are all so far, I guess, state and NGO sources. When you get to the federal arena, it gets a little bit more complicated, but every county is probably going to have an NRCS office, so USDA, NRCS, and they may have knowledge, but what they really have are purse strings. NRCS is going to have that cost share opportunity for landowners in most cases. Now, some states also have cost share. We have a little bit. Missouri has a good cost share program. I know Louisiana, some other states have cost share programs, but those are kind of your big, you want to think about when you're becoming that apprentice to fire or to apprentice to anything, you want to kind of build your team. And what's that team you're going to build? And it's made up of these individuals, perhaps from some of these groups. And then secondarily, you want to find, peers with authority. So if you've got a buddy that, funny story. I mean, I learned a lot from a guy who retired from timber company. And, back in the day, they used to burn as much as anybody. There are those folks out there on the landscape. And if you find them, you can hold on to them. A lot of those people really enjoy sharing their knowledge. I get like that. I talk about being a plant guy. It's so funny when people ask plants, you get so excited about it. I get to share my skill, so it's, I
know that one.
yeah, exactly. Like,
finally, I have a skill.
Yeah, this weird thing that I know that I can share with somebody. Anyway.
Well, yeah, now they're basically all of my skills they've made an app for that's better than me. So
that's it.
We're dwindling them away.
The AI is going to take over the world. Right?
Yeah, you said something a minute ago that prompted me to recollect something that I tell people a lot. I think it's true no matter what your experience level is, but especially, today we're kind of speaking to people that are just starting out with fire. And I think it's super valuable for those people, like as they're monitoring the weather and as they're starting to burn, keep notes, buy a little cheap notebook that is just your fire notebook that you keep with your fire stuff. And not only jot down the conditions that you burned under, but then make sure that you go back after the burn, day of, and then maybe even a few weeks later, and then maybe even a couple months later, and note your observations, like how much coverage did I get? What was the relative intensity?
Yeah.
How did the plants respond? Those types of things, because what's going to happen is this, especially on a smaller tract, prescribed fire can be a relatively infrequent thing. But I mean, even if you go a year between burns, right? You burn one dormant season, you're not going to burn again until the next dormant season. That stuff gets cobwebs on it, and you forget.
Absolutely.
So being able to go back and reference that is extremely valuable.
And I'm really bad at that. You would think I would be better since I have to do the burn plans and all that stuff. But what I've started doing is I screenshot the weather and then I take pictures. I'm a big picture taker.
That's awesome.
But if you screenshot the weather on your phone, pull it up and whatever the weather is that day, screenshot the weather, and then I have an app that I use that does the sounding, like what I've really started trying to get into how smoke disperses in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
And I have an app that does the sounding, so it shows basically how the air pressure and the temperature is changing as we go vertically, in the atmosphere. And so I'll screenshot that and I take pictures of the smoke and all this stuff. And it stays on my phone forever, but then I get it on my little iCloud or whatever, and I'll make it into folders and all later on someday when it's raining. And I do go back and reference that. Now, I'm particularly do that because I build PowerPoints and junk like that all the time. But I also have gone back and referenced it from the standpoint, we start talking about inversions, and I have a little mini data set, a little thing that I can piddle with and go, when the weather was X, we were more likely to have an inversion, and the SKUT says it was going to be this way, and the smoke actually dispersed, this way. And also, again, it's, keeping that book is not something that works for me because I'm very forgetful. and my book is I probably left it, on the tractor or whatever. I don't have a pen most of the time. If I make it out of the house with my keys and my phone, it's that's a win that day. But generally you're going to hold on to your phone. And so like I said, screenshotting the weather and then taking pictures of the fire. And that's also important, man. I don't want to, scare people and start talking about liability, but, proving that you had the containment you said you had sometimes, if that ever comes into play, you do want to have a little bit of photographic evidence sometimes. So anyway, there's that.
Yeah, good stuff. You got something, Will?
No, I'm thinking right now. I was trying to process all that. I'm a little slow.
Well, I was going to say you could probably have some of these AI things take notes for you now, John, where you could just talk to it and it'll just do it for you. Maybe you'll become a better note taker with that.
I don't want it learning from me though. You know how they're like, oh, it's machine learning, like it's going to learn. Like, I don't think it needs to learn from me. I think that's a mistake. Like, I think it should.
We don't
probably learn from somebody else.
AI dumber.
Yeah, exactly. I thought about this deeply.
Marcus has got us on
AI. Learn from everybody. Yeah, it shouldn't learn from everybody. Like, there should be,
Yeah.
You know, anyway.
That's hilarious.
I started
Yeah.
us out at stone tablets, and Marcus has got us to AI now.
Yeah. No, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, just like write it in rocks, and then when you come back, you'll see your notes.
I carve
Uh,
my wind speed, ambient temperature, RH, dispersion, all
Yeah.
that, and I find a tree, next to the burn unit, so
Yeah.
I can go back and reference it later on.
Yeah, if the tree dies, it was too hot.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Yeah, so
Pretty funny. So
Yeah.
on the getting started thing, just circling back around really quick. So if people are new to it, and again, we got a little bit ahead of ourselves on some of these things. All this stuff sounds so intimidating, but I mean, you can start as small as a half-acre block in your backyard, burning your leaves off. When we can't burn, we can't get a permit for fireworks shops. Sometimes what we'll do is, I mean, literally blow some leaves up in a parking lot, and we'll do a little burn on some leaves in a concrete parking lot. And that's as much of a teaching tool for folks sometimes
Yeah.
to see that. And
Yeah.
you can do different fuels. We've got, obviously you got a little 1 acre of broom sedge. It's quite a bit different than 1 acre of oak litter that's damp. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And looking at the smoke and start talking about that. So sometimes we mess up, people like us when we make things really big, when they could be a lot more simple. But I mean, I don't want to get people too comfortable with something like fire and they have a bad experience. My opinion, we talk a lot about why people don't burn and they're afraid of fire because of something they see on the news from California, or got the Smokey Bear coloring book when they were little and Smokey told them not to do it. I don't feel like that's as big a deal as like the personal experience. So my mother, one time we were burning piles in the backyard and a fire got, we just intended enough. And it started running around the yard. And again, this is after I'm a burn manager. No big deal. We'll put it out. My mom lost her mind. And so from now on, all fires are the devil. And when she'll call me and she's like, what are you doing? I'm burning. Oh, get off the phone. I mean, it's just that one experience for her was so bad. And almost everybody that you talk to has a fire story. They're going to go, when I was a kid one time we were burning off some food plots at the hunting camp and I'll never burn again,
Yeah.
But you think about it, that's a traumatic event. And the way we work through traumatic events, post-trauma, is going to be with community. And it's going to be, getting together with other people and trying to figure out. So let's not leave the human aspect out of this whole thing. I think a big part is going to be fire is a community. There are people like we talked about, this habitat team that we've talked about building, but it's your peers, your neighbors, other people like that. And so when you start executing something like that and it's got some level of fear and some level of, I guess, uncertainty that's associated with it, the way we work through that is by having a peer group. If you look at the Alcoholics Anonymous groups and all that kind of stuff, people that are working through trauma, people that are working through bad experiences, we got to get together with groups of people. So let's not leave that out of the equation. I think that's a big part of it. And nowadays maybe the social media side of it is a thing, and maybe that's something that does it for some people. I would encourage people to talk across the fence. We left my point, big loop to get back to. Everybody's got a neighbor, and I think starting with your neighbor, starting with your friends, your family, folks like that. I think these are things that people sometimes don't know that are interesting.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about these prescribed burn associations that I've seen that's been really funny is once we get a few burns under people's belt, at least they'll invite their friends from town out and they'll come and see. And then all of a sudden they're really interested in it. There's a science to it that everybody can find some aspect of it that appeals to them. I feel like it's pretty funny. So let's not leave the human side of it out there. And then again, we want to be obviously careful and not have as many traumatic events.
Yeah. Damn, that got deep, John. I didn't know we were going to talk about healing from trauma and all that today, but that's
No,
good.
man.
Yeah, really
it.
good stuff.
That's it.
But yeah, to add to that, I feel like, a lot of times people do really well when it seems intimidating starting with a small area. They can see the whole burn unit. Something like a little field or a food plot is relatively straightforward. Probably easier to put some fire breaks around.
Sure.
And get to bare soil and things like that. And then Another thing that I've seen landowners have success with is, hey, just, pay somebody that's experienced to do your first few burns, especially if that's a person that doesn't mind you at least watching, from a safe distance or whatever. And then a lot of times, I mean, I feel like the biggest barrier to entry is the way people perceive what prescribed fire actually looks like versus how it actually looks when you're there.
Yeah.
Like a good burn is relatively uneventful. And once
Correct.
they see that, it shifts that perspective. And they may not necessarily be ready to go out and try it themselves tomorrow, but they're getting closer to that point.
Yeah, I agree with that. You certainly, if your comfort level is not there, and you're the one out, physically, if you don't have there is a minimum physical standard, I
Sure.
would imagine, that folks have to get involved in. So, there's always going to be the need to probably have somebody you can outsource that work to, and that's fine. I've seen people get creative with it and pay for the difficult burns. I've got a landowner who burns his own fields, but he pays for timber burning because he, doesn't want to mess up he's got a economic objective with the timber. I got another landowner who's a pretty good burner, and he actually pays the commission comes out sometimes and burns. And on the day they come and burn one place, he goes and burns another place on the same property.
Mhm.
He's like, well, if it goes bad, they're here. So, so I've got, a backup, getting creative with that, not just, straight up, outsourcing folks. Everybody thinks about it. You think about it, I guess, like any other, contractual labor that you would outsource, but there's ways to be creative with it. I would say also, depending on the contractor, sometimes you can trade goods for services. Sometimes you can trade, I've got people that, anyway, it goes back to building that network. So it's, no, I mean, I've said we got heavy equipment operators that will trade out burning for, equipment operation, or they'll trade out hunting rights for burning. There's all kinds of different stuff that you can look at, different options for offsetting that cost. We can talk about that for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody might come out and help you burn if you trade them a turkey for it,
Just throwing that out
Good
there.
point. Good point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, guys, it's been great conversation. And I was thinking about, earlier we were talking about putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
And I think,
Did we do that?
well, we might have traversed about half of the Oregon Trail and backwards.
And forgot our horses.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, man.
well, what I was going to say is, you guys threw out the quail example and the deer example, and I think our audience probably has a pretty good handle on why we would burn for turkeys. But I'd like to hear John articulate why do you think folks should be considering burning for turkeys?
Sure. Well, early successional plant communities tend to be very good brood rearing cover, and that tends to be limiting on the landscape. If you look at the turkey research in terms of use, and James Martin has a good paper here, days since burn, and this is in piney woods, longleaf pine and pine regions of the South. When we get further away from a burn, the likelihood of a turkey using that place goes down drastically. There's actually a sharp drop when you get as much as 2 years away. And if you get into the woods yourself, if you're, outside much, and you look around, it makes sense, right? When something gets to be a 2 or 3 year rough, it's pretty tough for a turkey to navigate. And they're already going to be, kind of corridor, they use a path of least resistant type animal anyway. So the more we can open up some components, some aspects of the area to make mobility easier, and then certainly to make for chicks to have above head cover, like kind of like bobwhites, to have cover overhead and then foraging opportunities below, that's going to be positive. So that would be that. And then also, lastly, I would say that there are a ton of turkeys shot with black feet. There is nothing that draws a damn bird in right before the turkey season like a burn in an upland community. Now, all that said, there's turkeys that live in big bottomland communities that's never seen a fire. So, I mean, to say that it's required, I don't know that I could say that. But if you own property and you turkey hunt and you want more turkeys and you're in a dry upland plant community, you absolutely should be using prescribed fire at some level to manage brood rearing cover, if nothing else.
I think that's a a great synopsis.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the soot foot,
Yeah.
we'll call it, angle. It has been kind of surprising to me, especially for folks that have followed me for a while, and certainly for this show or either of you guys. I still get questions, about the last week of February or first week of March with folks that they're interested in going and burning, but they don't want to mess up their turkey hunting.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, thank you. We missed the mark on this one for you. Like, they just hadn't. I guess they're still worried about the disturbance, right before their season, messing things up, especially when they got their birds patterned or whatever. And I'm glad that you brought that up again. That some of our work where we've had cameras that we're putting in literally while the fire is still burning in the unit, show them arriving the same day.
Oh yeah.
Or certainly by the next day, where they're in there using that burn unit, and a lot of times they're strutting, when they're doing it. So they're strutting around with females and picking around in there. So I definitely don't think that should be a barrier to folks, and it should be a good reason for you to be considering fire on your land if you're interested in attracting turkeys legally.
Sure, you got to have some common sense now. If you own 200 acres, you don't need to burn 190 of it the day before opening. You know what I mean? You got to have some sense. But yeah, using fire to some level can absolutely be an attractant during the turkey season.
I think that's good.
Yeah, I think that's solid. Anything else, John, that you want to leave folks with that are interested in getting out there and doing some burning?
No, man, I've already gotten down into the psychology. We're we talked about the id and the we've gotten hierarchy of needs out of the way. We're good, man. We're good.
I love it. A gentleman and a scholar.
Well, John, again, I know you got a lot going on, especially this time of year, trying to help folks get burning and getting out on the fire line. So thanks for taking the time to do this with us. And
for a second time.
Yeah. And thanks everybody out there for listening. We appreciate all the support. This is another episode driven by our audience. We've gotten quite a few requests to have a logistics conversation on getting started. So hope everybody out there enjoyed it, and hope it gives you some confidence to get out there and start getting some fire on the ground.
It's an exciting time of the year right now. Getting some fire.
For many reasons.
Yeah, starting to get some fire on the landscape. We're starting to shift our heads towards turkeys more so, and season's coming around the corner.
Well, you know what? Yesterday morning, we were supposed to record yesterday, and I had to cancel because we had a group of 18 turkeys come in. When I was sitting in the blind, 2 strutters came in gobbling with all these hens. And I got to watch it all go down. It took us about 20 minutes to get them in a position where we could safely capture them.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you what, it got me pretty fired up.
Were they hammering?
They were hammering it.
Oh my God.
Just crushing it. Both of them were 4-year-old birds, based on their spur length at least. Just stud turkeys. And we caught all of them. And it got me pretty fired up. And that was intended to be a pun. Yeah. Thanks everybody for listening.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.